Hi, today we're going to cover the disassembly and reassembly of the standard steering column on 65-66 Corvair. A few differences between 65 and 6. I'll try and cover them when I hit there. First things first, before you take the steering column apart, make sure you do two things. Number one, get your wheels turned straight ahead on the car so that you'll put it back together the way it's supposed to be. Second, disconnect your battery. You'll be working near the horn, and the way things happen, you'll knock something loose or you'll hit something and the horn will start honking, and that's very disconcerting. Disconnect the battery and wheel straight ahead. Very simple. This is a Corsa steering column, but the Mons is identical. Pull off the horn button. This particular horn button has been through a lot. It's got the 4 screws holding these spring clips on, where usually they're just peened in place, but this one was well fixed. I don't know who did it, not me, but somebody did a good job. So first thing we're going to do is take the horn arm out, and there's 3 screws in here that retain that. And down in the bottom you can see that the nut and the washer to retain the steering wheel onto the column is there. We'll get to that in a minute. First thing we're going to do is take these 3 screws off, and if you are careful about taking them loose, leave them in place. That way, when you get all 3 loose, you can lift the horn arm assembly out as a unit, keeping everything in place. This shows you what's underneath there. There's 2 plastic and metal rings. The plastic one is keyed on the metal. It has little tabs that keep it in place. You can take those out as a pair. Underneath that, you obviously see the nut and the washer that retains the wheel. Also, you have the little horn pass-through. This is spring-loaded internally, so both sides end up being spring-loaded. So when it drops in place, the contact pushes on the bottom to connect down to the column, on top to connect to the horn. You can take that out. You may have to, by the way, you may have to take this apart and clean it out, because sometimes they get sticky and fail to make good contact. It just snaps off. This ring at this end just snaps off, comes apart. Be prepared for a spring to come loose, but there you go. Now you have the steering wheel and the nut. This is a 7/16 thread, same thread, by the way, as the wheel lug on the Corvair. So undo that nut. Now in this case, the steering wheel has been barely squeezed in place on this column, because it's obviously not on the car. It may come loose at any moment because I haven't got it very tight, but that's how you'll normally end up with it. You'll have the column there with the shaft sticking out. If you're really lucky, the steering wheel will instantly pop loose and you can continue on. Usually, however, you'll have to put something on here to pull that column, pull the steering wheel off the column. So before you do that, apply the steering wheel removal. Put the nut back on, and the reason you put the nut back on is in the car is when you do pop it loose, if there's no nut on there, it'll pop off into your lap, which is a little bit, again, kind of disconcerting. So I recommend putting the nut back on. The other reason is it gives the steering wheel puller something to lean against other than the tip end of the shaft that you have on your steering. This is a puller adapter that I made. You can buy them, commercial ones, but basically you've got a piece of plate. This is aluminum, it could be steel, and 2 holes drilled 1.5 inches apart. This has 2 settings because there's other columns that are different, but this is the Corvair one, 1.5 inches. They're 5/16 thread, 5/16 18 thread. That's a coarse thread. And I use the washers because you never know what depth it's going to be when you put it together. But this just drops down in, pull the nuts down tight. As soon as you get them snug down tight, then you're putting pressure on pulling the wheel loose. And in this case, it's probably going to pop loose pretty easily. Like so. The wheel is now popped loose. Take the screws off. Whenever I store this, I store it with a nut on each end to keep everything from falling loose. And I keep it in a bag. Now you have the wheel loose on the column. There's a spring underneath which will push it up. Take the nut off. and you can lift the wheel off. On the back side of the wheel is a turn signal canceling cam. These are available new if you need them. They're really cheap. They mount with 3 little tips out the back that stick into the back of the steering wheel. These 3 little tips. And it only goes in one way. Now, technically, those little tips will stick in 3 different ways, but it has to be aligned so that the horn pass-through hole is in the correct location. I just leave it with the wheel if you can. Now you have the column open for inspection. There's a spring you need to remove, and you'll see here the C-shaped actuator driven by the turn signal arm that you're familiar with. Oftentimes, by the way, this is why you'll have it open to this point. You'll have broken the actuator. It'll broken either one of the ends or something has broken this arm. And if you hit the arm incorrectly or climbing in or out of the car, it'll break that actuator at the bottom. So this is where you'll be. The original is held in place with a 1/4 inch drive hex screw that you take out, and then the shaft, the turn signal, drops loose. Now you have the actuator, and you can see how it operates in there. The actuator's got to come out. Well, before that can come out, you're going to have to drop the bell down, and because the actuator is held in with a screw from the back side. But on the 66, and this is where one of the differences on 65s and 6s. On 65s, loosen the 3 screws and the bell just drops down. On the 66, because the column shaft is trapped in the column, you're going to have to pull that shaft up and remove a little snap ring that goes around it. You can see the snap ring. If you look closely, you can see the round snap ring. And if you have a 66 and you've never worked on it before, it's going to take some convincing for you to know that there really is a snap ring there. It's so hidden, it's just hard to see. So taking the snap ring out with it in the car is much easier actually than doing it on the bench, because this shaft will pull up when you're trying to get that to that snap ring. I have a special tool I built to do that, and the special tool is no more than a piece of aluminum strap with a couple of holes, hole drilled in it, and a couple of arms, so that when you put it in place and tighten it up, I use the washer and the original nut from the steering wheel. What that does is pull the shaft up, giving you better access to that snap ring. You don't really need this. If you're really good, you can pull it up somehow. This just makes it easier. And then when you do that, the snap ring becomes much more visible and easier to get out. Now, conventional snap rings will have a hole at the tips that you can put a pair of pliers into and snap. This doesn't do that. It's just a piece of round steel stock in a little groove. So the easiest way I found to do that is try and separate the snap ring at one side and put a thin screwdriver in on the other side. Then you're out of the groove and you can lift it up and then walk around the shaft like so. As I said, with it in the car, the groove is usually easier to see than it is when it's out of the car. Again, the snap ring is only used on the 66, but it's necessary to remove it to take that column loose. Once the snap ring's loose, you can see that in a moment, you can take the tool off, and I'll show you an alternative way at this point. If you don't have this tool, and you probably don't, you can make one or something similar pretty easily. I made this up ahead of time. This is a standard lug nut for a Corvair 7/16/20. You can screw it on there and pull up on the shaft. And again, you can do it with a standard lug nut. All you do is put the lug nut part of the way onto the end and put a longer bolt on. you can pull it up. I just made this because it's easier. You can see the snap ring now in place as I've popped it off. Take the snap ring off. Now there are 3 screws that hold the bell in place. One of them is down in the depths of the actuator, and the 2 others are much more visible. All 3 have to come completely loose and out for it to come apart. Now, oftentimes you're at this point of the disassembly because you have to replace this actuator. It breaks, again, oftentimes because of the arm breaking it. But to replace it, you have to come this far apart because it's retained by a screw on the underside of this. To do that, the bell drops down. You can lift the full turn signal switch up slightly, go in from the bottom, and undo that 1 screw. And it's the unit itself, the actuator is available separately. Clark's carries them. And they're, I'm sure, used on a ton of other cars, but they're definitely on the 65.6 Corvair. And same one is used on both years. Same turn signal switch is used on both years. So, once you get the screw out and loose, the actuator will lift straight up, and it has an O-ring. You see the little O-ring at the bottom, and it's greased to give the actuator slop so it'll move back and forth and actuate. So if you need to replace it, this is as far as you need to go, is to take that out, put the new one in. The originals have a rubber, which is now hard as a rock, rubber piece to deaden the sound primarily. But you can see where it rides on these 2 arms. And that's what cancels your cam and cancels the turn signals and makes it go back. This point you could replace, if you need to, you can replace the upper bearing assembly. This ring is where the horn pass-through rides. The bottom of it rides in it when it's moving around. This would be a good time, since you have it this far apart, to polish that. Take a little brass polish or metal polish and polish that ring to give you a better connection. If you need to replace the old turn signal assembly, this is where you do it. The bottom of the actuator has this little tab that sticks out. That tab rides in the middle of the turn signal switch. The tricky thing on the turn signal switch is what it has to do in operation. It has to disconnect the brake light and turn on the turn signal. Either way, left or right. And the reason for that, of course, is that if you have the brakes on and you're making a turn, if it doesn't flash, the person coming up behind you won't see the flash. So it's got to bypass the brake light feed and feed it the turn signal flasher instead. It also feeds the dash signal and the one in the front, but it has to disconnect those brake lights at the same time. That's what these little brass arms do inside here. And it is difficult to work on this. If it's broken or they're bent or something's happened, it's a pain to get them correct and operating correctly. Probably easier just to buy the new switch, even though it's expensive, but they are available. Okay, so the arm rides in there, and when you put this back together again, we're now going to go to assembly. Put this back together again. It goes back in the same place. Again, you can grease this a little bit to make it easier life. And then this arm, this piece in the arm, has to drop down into the middle of that switch. So be careful as you drop it down. It's pretty easy to do. Get it correct and pushes into place. Then you come in from the bottom with that same screw you took out. Tighten the screw. The actuator arm sticks through, so all you're doing is holding it in place, not clamping it in place. So you can go ahead and snug this up without fear of tightening the turn signal. When you're done, turn signal's whole assembly drops back into place. And the easiest way to line this up to put those screws back is to line up the hole in the bell that that arm is going to go through. So you line that up. Start tightening the same 3 screws. One of the rules I use always when I'm tightening a pattern of screws is to get them all started before tightening any of them. That just makes life easier of trying to align a screw that is just slightly off. If you have them all 3 started, in this case all 3 or in any pattern, then it makes it easier to get them all tightened up. Once these are tight, you have this assembly. It's time to put that snap ring back in. And I recommend putting a snap ring in before installing the turn signal arm, because you're going to have to work around this area. Again, I'm going to use the special tool and the original nut to pull the arm, pull that center shaft back up. When you're in the car, the shaft is pretty stable, but when you're on the bench, workbench like this, when you loosen and remove that snap ring, actually I'm going to put the snap ring over first. When you remove that snap ring, there's nothing retaining the shaft from falling out the bottom. That's good if you want the shaft out the bottom, but if you're working on it, you don't. You want to have it retained. And again, in the car, it's not as big a problem. So tightening this up is pulling that shaft up underneath, leaving the groove for the snap ring available. Now, you just need to slide that snap ring down into place, and I'm sure there's a nice tool to do that, but 2 screwdrivers usually make it work for me, like so. Just snap right into place. Before you put the snap ring in, you want to make sure that you haven't overexpanded it when you're taking it out, so you make sure it's still nice and tight so it goes down into place. Once it's in, you can undo the nut, and what that'll do, of course, is lower that snap ring into its place on top of the upper bearing. You can check now to make sure everything's working correctly. Next, you're going to put the turn signal actuating arm back in place. That's held in place by this screw. Now you're ready to put the steering wheel back on. And again, if you've kept the wheel straight ahead, it should be easy enough to find the straight ahead position for the steering wheel and drop it into place. But in the 66, you have this spring that rides under there, so the spring's got to go in first, then the steering wheel. And you can see how the spring keeps the wheel up a ways. You can just push it down with one hand and right the nut down with the other. And now would probably be a good time for you to check the turn signals to make sure everything works correctly. If you actuate it to the left, turn the wheel to the left and back, it turns it off. Same to the right. So this is installed correctly. Now you're going to put the rest of the horn mechanism back together. The horn pass-through has to drop in first, and it's spring-loaded. Spring's working fine. Then you have these 2 plates. Now the plate is symmetrical. All 3 holes are symmetrical, and the plastic piece is tab located on the ring. It can't move around. But you can install this in any of the 3 positions. As I said, since it's symmetrical, you can tell on the back side where it's been riding. So you can just move it over one, and now you have a new surface riding on that horn pass-through. The next item is the horn arm. And if you left it all together, you can just drop it into place, center it on the hub, and you'll feel the screws drop into the correct locations. In this case, you might want to run one down almost tight to make sure it all holds in place as you get to the others. the torque value for that nut is in the shop manual. I think it's about 40 pounds, but check before you torque it. It's not terribly tight because you don't want to have to pull it off from terribly tight later. 3 screws hold it down, and you have your horn switch, horn button to drop into place, and you're done. Pretty simple. Next time we'll take apart a telescopic steered column. It's a little more complex. Enjoy. Thank you.